Hi there. Going to do another episode of Mayor of Bitcoin. This time I'll be doing an educational Monday series on understanding micropayments and mental transaction costs. With a little bit of teaser of something I'll be discussing in the future that will be very important for people who are interested in knowing where the future of blockchain is headed. Okay, so let's just jump into it. What are micropayments and what are mental transaction costs? I believe these terms are pretty sort of intuitive in terms of the way that they've been used. So when you think micropayment, you want to think the payment below negotiated value, a negligible or unnoticeable amount. So anything that is below the value at which you would proceed to negotiate further for human payments and human transactions, you can think of as a micropayment. Now, when you think about what computers are willing to negotiate, well, a computer is willing to negotiate the penny or half a penny. It's infinite, basically to the extent at which electricity has cost. The computer is willing to get more precise or to the level of precision that electricity costs more than calculating the numbers. So for a computer, it's quite infinite. For a human, you should think about micropayments in terms of minutes of time. So if you value your time at 50 cents an hour and it takes you 10 minutes to negotiate a transaction, at this costs you 8 cents. If you value your time at $50 an hour and it takes you 10 minutes to negotiate a transaction, then this costs you $8. So what is the micropayment in terms of human time for these people? And so for someone who makes $50 an hour or values his time at $50 an hour, then each minute of their time is worth 80 cents. So a micropayment to them might be something below $8, something below that. And then if you value your time at $6 an hour, then each minute of your time is worth 10 cents. So a micropayment to you might be below a dollar, but maybe above 10 cents. Maybe at a value above 10 cents, you're willing to spend a minute or two to correct it. And then if you value your time at like about a dollar, which for the developed Western world, most people value their time, in this range here. For the higher end Western world, they value their time around here. And then for the developing or undeveloped, whichever you refer to it, nations, the world median average is really around 50 cents. But for like India, South America, so forth, you're going to get into the $1 to $4 range. So this is for the developing world. This is roughly what their micropayment level might be. And so for them, um, so if you value your time at 50 cents, then your time is valued at roughly a penny a minute. So you might negotiate if something's 8 cents off. And that's if you value your time at 50 cents, 50 USD. All right, so Nick Szabo, he defines a micropayment as a tenth of a cent. Um, and I suggested a value at a nickel for micropayment. But this is in reference to a human micropayments. For computer micropayments, I think Zaspo's closer to correct, perhaps. But I might say it's even smaller because the cost of using electricity isn't very significant. But the cost of minutes of time of humans is significant even at 50 cents an hour. Okay, so now mental transaction cost. What is mental transaction cost and how is that different from micropayment? Well, a mental transaction cost is basically the overall cost or time it takes you to perform a transaction and to think about a transaction. So for Bitcoin, for your first Bitcoin transaction, you have to hear about Bitcoin. You have to download. Maybe you download Bitcoin, you sync it, you run a node, you create a backup, you acquire the public key of the people you're trying to pay, you calculate the transaction fee, you send the transaction, you verify it went through on the blockchain, and then lastly, you acquire your goods from the merchant. So that might be the mental cost of transacting over Bitcoin. So here we're talking about negotiating a specific value, and here we're saying from start to finish or a repeat scenario. So the mental transaction cost of performing your first Bitcoin transaction is very high, and then performing a second Bitcoin transaction, you have to acquire the public key, calculate the transaction fee, send the transaction, and then verify that it went through. So so for your second one, relative to using a credit card, Bitcoin is actually probably less mentally taxing than using a credit card, which exposes all your credit card data to the internet, and it could get stolen, hacked, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas performing your second Bitcoin transaction is not terribly mentally taxing if you can access your Bitcoin software easily. So people talk about using mobile wallets. Just to, as a side note here, people should be aware of this. Everybody has a cell phone these days, or a lot of people do. So if you can get your Bitcoin to be an app, and if this app can read a QRC code using your phone's camera, then you can get your phone to acquire the Bitcoin public address, and then the wallet would automatically calculate and send the transaction with just a click of the button. And then after 20 minutes, maybe it verifies and everything's good. So that's one thing that's coming up. And another thing that's coming up is the Lightning Network, totally different issue, but other ways of batching transactions to reduce the mental transaction cost. That's the primary goal right now in blockchains, is reducing mental transaction cost. Micropayments is a totally different issue, but they're both important to understand, and I'll go into why in another video. So, okay, so more about mental transaction costs. Um, so, so I'm just going to do a brief overview of some things I'll discuss in another video. So when thinking about Bitcoin, you really want to think about Bitcoin movement fees as separate from transaction fees. So transaction being maybe 1,000 transactions are batched into one Bitcoin movement transaction or Bitcoin movement fee. So the Bitcoin movement fee is static in terms of Satoshis, and the transaction fees are completely variable depending about the number of transactions that are bunched into one Bitcoin movement transaction. And then another thing to think about is the Bitcoin bonuses. People often refer to this as block reward. Bitcoin bonus is much more accurate. And the Bitcoin bonus currently is 1.2 billion Satoshis per 10 minutes or per block. So the block reward is the combination of Bitcoin movement fees and Bitcoin bonus fees. And so we'll go over this more at another time. But currently there's about 1 megabyte per block, and it's about 45% utilized, which means there can be 2,000 Bitcoin movements per 10 minutes or per block. So that's just something that you can start to puzzle this out together later. But 1.2 billion satoshis are awarded for completing a block that can contain up to 2,000 Bitcoin movements. And on top of those Bitcoin movements, there's a number of satoshis awarded as movement fees, which, for example, over Christmas, it was roughly 4.5 Bitcoins per block. But at 1 satoshi per byte, or maybe 10 satoshis per byte, this is going to come out to a very small percent of the overall block award. So over Christmas, maybe the movement fees amounted to 36% of the block reward, but typically they're less than 1%, or even less than 0.1%. So, okay, that's all I had to mention for now. And I hope you feel better about understanding how to define micropayments in terms of human micropayments or computerized micropayments, and how to understand mental transaction cost in terms of the first mental transaction as opposed to reoccurring transactions. All right, thank you. Bye bye.